Hi, my name is John, and I'm the owner of this YouTube channel. And today I want to talk about the 1972 Women's Artistic Gymnastics Code of Points. I don't actually have an official copy of this code, but I do have this book, and a large portion of the book discusses the code. And I also noticed that Jackie Fye is one of the authors, and she was, I think, the head of the Women's Technical Committee throughout much of the 90s, and I know that she played a major role in the codes of points used at the 1996 and 2000 Olympics. This code was relatively simple, I would say, in comparison to codes to come. There was a relatively straightforward formula for calculating the difficulty of exercises on the floor, beam, and uneven bars. 6 of the 10 points total came from composition. Gymnasts were required to have 2 elements that were considered superior in difficulty and also 4 elements of medium difficulty. So it appears that the table of elements is split into 3 categories, the latter 2 being the elements of difficulty, whether they be medium or superior. So it doesn't look like elements were divided into alphabetically named categories, but if they were, they would probably have been divided into A, B, and C skills. 1.5 points came from the originality and combinations and connections of the exercise, with 0.5 coming from general impression. 4 points were awarded for execution and the lack of execution faults, and then 1.5 for technical execution, whatever that means. And then 1.5 for amplitude, and then 1 point for the general impression of the exercise. Interestingly, there were some rules governing the team as a whole. So there was a 0.3 penalty for the team if more than 2 members used the same mount or same dismount. And on the vault, no more than 4 vaults could be the same out of the 12 vaults total that would have been performed in the optionals round. So I'm assuming that there were probably 6 gymnasts on a team, and they each performed 2 vaults. And that's where the 12 total came from. Interestingly, this book, and so I assume the Code of Points, explicitly recommends that the difficulties performed, if they went beyond the number required, should be added very cautiously in order to avoid faults and deductions. The book says that gymnasts of lower caliber should do what they are capable of with perfection, which to me implies a different emphasis than we currently have in the Code of Points. There were also deductions for the balance of different elements. So if a gymnast performed 4 superior elements and only 0 medium elements in a routine, they would get a 0.5 deduction for an unbalanced exercise. And the same would be true for a routine with 8 medium elements and no superior elements. So again, quite an emphasis on doing 2 superior elements and 4 medium ones. There also seems to be a repetition rule in the Code of Points, a 1/10 deduction for the same difficulty performed in succession more than 3 times, with the exception of the back handspring. The structure of a competition was different than we are accustomed to now. The compulsory routines were still part of competition, and that comprised day 1 of competition at a competition like the Olympics or the World Championships. The second day, which we now call the team final, involved the performance of the optional routines. This was before the new life system, which started in 1989, meaning that the winner in the all-around won because of the combined total of 3 days of competitions. compulsories, the optionals, and then the all-around competition. And then winners in the event finals won because of a combined score out of a total of 20 involving the optional and event final performances. Some people argue that the inclusion of the compulsories made it possible to ensure gymnasts had good form and good foundational technique. Opponents of the compulsories, when they were eliminated after the 1996 Olympics, argued that they were maybe not as interesting to spectators and made it more difficult for less developed countries to get into the sport. Here, though, you see sort of a general rubric for how compulsory routines were evaluated. This is an excerpt of some of the vaults from the Code of Points. You see that vaulting was rather basic in this day and age, and gymnasts like Nellie Kim and Nadia Comaneci really revolutionized the sport when they introduced vaults with saltos like the Tsukahara vault. In this code, I don't see many of the things that came later, like a system for value raising or otherwise evaluating connections and awarding specific bonus points for them. It seems like it's expected that the gymnast will combine elements in a way that is commensurate to the difficulty of the routine. And the major emphasis for scoring seems to be the completion of elements of certain levels of difficulty. Here is an excerpt of some of the elements on the balance beam, in particularly the highest category of difficulty. And I noticed that simply connecting two back walkovers, doing a one-handed walkover, or a back handspring was sort of considered the maximum level of difficulty. Olga Korbut really pushed the envelope when she introduced a back salto on the balance beam at, I believe, the 1976 Olympics. This section looks like it explains the part of the score that comes from the originality component. I do also notice that the deductions for falls were different than what we were used to in later codes of points. So it looks like a fall from the uneven bars was a 1 point penalty, 0.5 for falls from the beam, and a full point for falls on the floor. And I remember seeing in a forum once that somebody suggested this was because of the relative ease of falling on different elements. At the time, gymnasts were not really doing a whole lot of release moves like we're used to now on the uneven bars, and so it was harder to fall. Similarly, a fall would be sort of harder to do on the floor exercise, and I think the lower penalty for the balance beam reflects the, ease of falling from that apparatus. But from this originality section, what I notice is a lot of emphasis on originality and also an emphasis on having a balanced and varied exercise. Something else that I don't see that was commonplace in, I think, all future Code of Points was a list of special requirements for which a certain number of points are awarded. So nowadays we're used to having 5 special requirements per apparatus, which contribute 0.5 towards the total score each. Instead, in this book, I see a rather lengthy summary of general characteristics suggested for different apparati. So these are the ones for the balance beam. I notice an emphasis on a variety of body positions, an emphasis on passes that involve large and small running steps, a variety of arm and leg movements, dance elements representing different dance traditions. Of course, the requirement for 2 superior elements and 4 medium elements. although they must, quote, be very thoughtfully and evenly placed throughout the exercise. It seems there's an expectation that the mount and dismount be commensurate with the rest of the exercise. Also, an emphasis on a variety of positions like sitting, standing, lying, and crouch positions. However, the code tells us that these should not exceed the number of upright positions on the balance beam, and also no more than 3 stops. And I noticed that they specify that a stop is still considered a stop even if the gymnast's arms are moving. And if I have one complaint about modern balance beam routines, especially many of the routines I saw at the U.S. Olympic gymnastics trials from last weekend, a lot of the gymnasts stop on the balance beam, but wave their arms in a manner that I don't particularly personally find aesthetically pleasing. I watched the Olympic trials with my mother, actually, and she commented on this several times, that during beam and floor routines, there aren't a whole lot of gymnasts that actually dance, or at least do so with their whole body. This book goes on to say, quote, the FIG code has placed considerable emphasis on the new concept of continuous beam movement. It is now forbidden to stop all movements of the feet and simply use the arms and hands. The previous practice of hiding stops in this manner is no longer permissible. The ideal routine has continuous execution with no pauses for stability prior to difficult passages or elements. The pace of the whole routine must be brisk but show an interesting variety and rhythm. So this is something that I do think has disappeared from modern gymnastics. Although, of course, in this day and age, gymnasts were not doing standing Arabians on the beam, so pausing was not quite as necessary. It does seem that the current code is trying to bring some of this back, particularly on floor exercise, by requiring that gymnasts dance into most of their passes on floor, albeit, in my opinion, with limited success. This excerpt shows us a hypothetical or recommended routine for a gymnast performing at an advanced level. While you look over that, let me summarize some of the composition suggestions. So there's an emphasis on linking skills without unjustified stops. So there's a 0.3 point deduction for interruptions between skills, 0.5 deduction for extra swings. They recommend a continuous flow of movement with 2 short stops permitted for momentary balance or as transitions to difficult elements. Stops in excess are worth 0.2 in deduction. Excessive repetitions of movement, such as the straddle glide kip or the same circling movement, must be avoided. Failure to do so can result in a penalty of up to 0.5 points. The mount and dismount should be in harmony with the rest of the routine. The penalty for a mount which is too simple or a dismount which is out of character is from 0.1 to 0.5 points. There's also a 0.3 deduction for using the same mount or dismount that is used in the compulsory exercises. Dismounts also had to be from the support of the hands or the body, but a dismount by somersault from a stand on the bar was not permitted and was worth a 0.5 deduction. So that must have changed at some point, because in the 80s, I know of gymnasts who did dismounts that involved standing on the bar and doing like a double twisting layout down to the floor. So, there's also a section that talks about how showing strength is not acceptable on the uneven bars. They acknowledge that, of course, uneven bars elements require strength, but the strength must not be obvious. There's also an emphasis on not repeating the same movements or type of movements, as this is considered poor composition. So actually, as a slight correction, this book was published in 1972, and the inside cover doesn't really tell me what month that it was published, but I think I'm going to assume that this must explain the 1969 through 1972 code points. And I think that's a reasonable assumption because, there's no mention of vaults with saltos or a back tuck on the balance beam. So I'm thinking that this does not really include new trends that emerged at the 1972 Olympics. This slide, though, gives us a sense of how vaulting was judged. It looks like different portions of the execution score came from different phases of the vault. And as you might guess, many of the same things are emphasized on the floor exercise: continuous movement, variety of dance, no stops, using the whole floor exercise, things like that. And looking at some of the suggested superior difficulty elements on the floor exercise, the hardest skills are somersaults, such as tucked, piked, laid out somersaults forwards and backwards, with or without twists, and backward handspring combinations. So not a particularly high level of difficulty. One other thing I think I'll say is I think that high school gymnastics in the United States still uses a lot of this same terminology. At least when I was hearing about high school gymnastics in the early 2000s, I remember those gymnasts using terms like high superior, medium superior, and that language sort of harkens back to this era in elite gymnastics. So that's all I think I have to say without going into excruciating detail. Let me know if you have any comments or especially corrections, because I've been known to make some mistakes in these videos. If I do and you point one out, I'll make a correction in the form of an annotation. One other plug is that I'm in the process of buying the 1985 code of points from the FIG. I just have to figure out how to send them a payment in Swiss francs, but once I receive that, I will be very excited to make a video about that code of points. So hopefully I'll have that in the next couple of weeks, and so stay tuned. Bye.